Redditors who left companies that nonstop talk about their amazing culture. What was the cringe moment that made you realize you had to get out? Story 1. We have a great culture, lots of team lunches and drinks. That was the sales pitch during my interview. They painted this picture of an office where coworkers clinked glasses every Friday, shared cake in the break room, and casually laughed over catered lunches like some kind of corporate family sitcom. I half believed it. Reality? Oh boy. On my very first week, I learned our boss had quite proudly banned the social club. No after-work gatherings, no office traditions, no just-for-fun events. Birthday celebrations? Outlawed. And not just a casual "we don't really do cake here," but an official, capital letters, statutorily no-cake policy. She also scrapped the Christmas party, canceled the Christmas break entirely. Yes, we worked straight through the holidays while the rest of the industry shut down. And as if that wasn't enough, she implemented what was essentially a no talking to each other rule unless it was strictly work-related. Meanwhile, she took every second day off herself, engineering long weekends like it was an Olympic sport. In the 2 years I worked there, we had maybe 3 so-called team lunches. She attended every one and made sure to remind us right at the table that we wouldn't be paid for any extra time over our official lunch break. Didn't matter if it was 15 or 20 minutes, she made us submit manual timesheet corrections to dock the time from our pay. Picture this, nibbling on your sandwich while your boss cheerfully tells you she's going to make sure you lose 20 minutes wages for this privilege. The cherry on top came in December. One of our clients, someone I'd worked closely with and built a great relationship with, invited me to their Christmas party. It was a nice gesture, and honestly, I was excited. Before I could RSVP, my boss personally called them to say I wasn't allowed to attend. Her reason? She was concerned I might reflect badly on the department. This, from a woman who spent more time at home than in the office and whose idea of great company culture was clearly just a marketing line on the careers page. The irony was so thick you could serve it at one of those non-existent birthday parties. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. I worked at an R&D tech startup where the motto was constantly thrown around, "Work hard, play hard." Sounds great, right? Except the reality was pretty different. They made it sound like if you put in the effort and stayed loyal, you'd be rewarded with pay raises. Spoiler alert, the people who'd been grinding there for 5 years hadn't seen a single extra penny. When those same loyal folks finally spoke up about the pay situation, guess what? They were quietly pushed out and replaced with cheaper hires. Meanwhile, the CEO casually showed up one day in a brand new Maserati. Cost more than my entire house. Yeah, I noped out fast. Story 3. Not my company, but one right across the street from where I used to work, in a big glass front building. From the outside, it looked like a startup paradise. Their entire ground floor, visible right from the sidewalk, was an open recreational area straight out of a Best Places to Work magazine spread. Foosball tables, pinball machines, billiards, console gaming stations, beanbag chairs, and even private video booths lined the space. Bright neon signs on the walls said things like, "Work hard, play hard," and "Innovation is fun." It was the kind of setup that made passersby stop, peer in, and probably think, "Wow, I wish I worked there." The thing is, I walked past that building almost every day for over a year, and it was always dead silent in there. No music from the karaoke booths, no laughter from a foosball match, no one leaning over a pool table lining up a shot. The most action I ever saw was the occasional person quietly using one of the internet kiosks alone. One day, I found out my friend worked there, and I finally asked him the question that had been nagging at me. Why is that amazing play area always empty? Doesn't anyone take a break? That's when he laughed, not in a happy way, and told me the truth. Apparently, anyone who did use those facilities, even just for a few minutes to blow off steam, would find it mysteriously mentioned in their performance reviews. Managers would subtly, or not so subtly, bring it up as a sign that maybe you weren't 100% committed, or that you could have spent that time on project deliverables. Even if you were a top performer, using the fun zone was basically a mark against you. Word spread quickly among employees, and before long, no one dared touch the place. It became a decorative showroom for their so-called amazing culture, a staged backdrop for recruitment videos and office tours to lure in fresh talent. The kicker? Their job ads were everywhere. Billboards, LinkedIn posts, subway ads, all bragging about how they were the ultimate work hard, play hard company. Except, the play part was just for show. Story 4. When I was in my early 20s, I worked for a small business where my boss liked to call the office one big family. He often referred to the female employees as his girls. At first it sounded harmless, maybe even a little flattering until it wasn't. One day, he called me into his office and handed me the company credit card. He told me I was to take a potential new client out for dinner and drinks, except there was a catch. He made it very clear he expected me to go the extra mile in a way that had nothing to do with business. His exact words made it clear this was about more than just winning a client over with good conversation. The pressure was intense, and the message was clear. My value at the company was tied to things that had nothing to do with my skills or work ethic. I refused. The next day, I quit. Looking back, I realize I probably got singled out because of how I looked at the time. But this wasn't about me. It was about his twisted view of business. A few months earlier, he'd invited me to his home for dinner, saying he appreciated how hard I'd been working. I was surprised and even a little flattered. But when I arrived, his wife and kids weren't home. Instead, there was a young man in the pool, the son of a client. My boss said he was trying to set me up on a date because I needed to get out more. At the time, I took it at face value. Later, I realized it was more of a test. After I left, I learned I wasn't the only one. Other female employees had faced similar requests. One of them, a young single mom, confided in me that she'd felt she couldn't say no because she needed the paycheck. That conversation stuck with me. When I quit, I asked my boss how old his own daughter would have to be before he'd expect her to do something like that. He didn't answer. The look on his face told me everything. Working for him taught me exactly how I didn't want to run a business. I've owned my own company for over 30 years now, and I've never once asked an employee to cross personal boundaries for the sake of work. Back then, stuff like this was often ignored or dismissed as just the way things are. Standing up to it felt like being on the front line of change, pushing for workplaces where women are respected. I wish I could say those days are long gone, but recent news reminds me that the fight for safe, respectful workplaces isn't over yet. Story 5. I used to work at B&Q, which for those outside the UK is basically our version of Home Depot. One day, something happened that still makes my stomach drop when I think about it. One of my colleagues was violently attacked in store by a customer. I was there when it happened, and the whole place descended into chaos, people shouting, running, someone calling for an ambulance. I remember standing frozen for a moment before realizing my coworker's life was in serious danger. We were all completely shaken. Most of us didn't sleep that night. The very next morning, management gathered all the staff into a big, echoing back room. There was no grief counselor, no offer of mental health support, no talk about making the store safer. Instead, they handed us a document and made it clear, sign this or you're out of a job. It was a waiver stating we wouldn't take legal action against the company over what had happened. No discussion, no explanation, just a pen pushed across the table. Everyone looked at each other, but we all knew if you didn't sign, you'd be unemployed by lunchtime. And the part that still makes my blood boil, this attack happened barely a month after corporate decided to get rid of our security guard to save money. The one person trained to prevent situations like this. For those wondering, yes, my colleague survived, but his life was permanently changed. B&Q kept running their cheerful ads about helping you improve your home like nothing had happened. While inside the store, we all just quietly carried on, knowing exactly how little the company valued the people working there. Story 6. Not me, but my husband once took a job with a family-owned and operated business that touted how important family was and that they were all one happy family. Every sentence out of management's mouth was about how they were one big happy family. how they always put family first, and how joining them meant you were more than just an employee. That lasted exactly 2 weeks. One morning, my husband was on his way to work, our then 2-year-old in the back seat, when disaster struck. Halfway to daycare, our son suddenly threw up all over himself, full toddler-scale eruption. My husband pulled over, called his manager, and explained the situation. He said he'd need to turn around, take our son home, get him cleaned up, and then he'd head in as soon as possible. You'd think a place that constantly preached about family values would be understanding. Instead, his manager hit him with, "You need to get your priorities straight." There was a long pause, then my husband said, "You know what? You're right. I won't be back in at all." And that was that. Luckily, he was still working part-time at his old job, a place that actually was sad when he said he was leaving. He called them, told them what had happened, and they immediately put him back on the full-time schedule. As for that family business, they're now in the middle of liquidating assets before going out of business entirely. Every time we drive past their emptying storefront, I can't help but cackle. Nothing says family first like collapsing under the weight of your own hypocrisy. Story 7. Last year, I was working as a subcontractor and got assigned to a new workplace. Everything seemed fine at first. 2 weeks in, the new boss even pulled me aside and said he wanted to hire me directly. I thought, great, maybe this will be an upgrade. Then he slid the contract across the desk. Compared to my current deal, it was, well, let's just say it was less opportunity of a lifetime and more, please volunteer for corporate servitude. Pay was down by 25%, average weekly hours up by 20%, vacation days down by 10%, and just for fun, no more personal use of the company car. But it gets better. Before I'd even read a single word of this glorious offer, he leaned forward and said, "I will only make you this offer once, but it's only valid if you change all your pictures on social media and you sell your car. It's too flashy for our company." So to recap, he wanted me to work more for less money, with fewer benefits, and on top of that, sell my own property because it offended his sense of corporate modesty. Yeah, how about no? Story 8. I worked for a company that loved to brag about being one of the top 100 places to work in the US. It was plastered everywhere. Recruiting ads, onboarding materials, even on the walls of the break room like some kind of corporate merit badge. They bought the hospital where I was already working in IT. At first, things were fine. They let me stay at my current location, and I threw myself into the transition. For an entire year, my team and I put in countless hours preparing to switch over all the IT infrastructure to match their systems. New software, new hardware, the works. It wasn't just a quick upgrade either. We replaced all 900 computers in the building. We worked nights, weekends, and long days to make sure everything was ready. When the last machine was up and running, I thought, okay, maybe this merger thing won't be so bad. Then came the surprise. I was told that in a few months, if I wanted to keep my job, I'd have to start commuting to the main campus. For me, that was over 5 hours round trip every day. No offer to transfer me somewhere closer. No relocation assistance. No fuel stipend. Nothing. Just, if you want to keep working here, this is where you'll be now. It wasn't about my performance. I'd just spent a year making sure their new hospital was tech-ready. The reason, a new manager had taken over at the start of the fiscal year and decided that every single member of our IT department needed to be physically at the main campus. No exceptions. So, I was essentially forced to quit. After a year of hard work and loyalty, my reward for helping them integrate a whole hospital's IT system was unemployment. But hey, at least they still get to tell everyone they're one of the top 100 places to work, right? Story 9. When I was working at a state university, we had a meeting where the vice president of the whole institution got up and laid out their vision for the future. I put that in quotes because, frankly, it was less of a vision and more of a corporate cost-cutting memo wrapped in academic buzzwords. According to him, the ideal scenario for every tenured faculty member was to write enough grant proposals, not just to cover our own salaries, but to fund our eventual replacement with teaching assistants. Every undergraduate class, every semester, taught by grad students or temps. Tenure was basically supposed to be a long con where you work yourself out of your own job. Oh, and since we were under a hiring freeze, we were encouraged to be creative and use temporary grant money to hire permanent tenured faculty. Let that sink in. Fund long-term positions with money that by definition was going to run out. And while they were at it, they announced we'd all be paying an extra $250 a year in parking fees so they could build a brand new student parking lot. Nothing says thank you for your dedication to higher learning like charging you more to park so the undergrads have somewhere closer to put their cars. At that point, I was already planning my exit. By the time the meeting ended, I was mentally halfway out the door. Edit. I can't name the exact state university system, and from the comments I've seen, they're far from unique, but if you're a prospective student, please ask questions, lots of them. Ask about accreditation and don't accept, we're finalizing it right now, or we're accredited by the other 3 colleges we're co-scamming with, as real answers. If you want to dig into the specific problem I'm talking about, ask what percentage of classes are taught by full-time faculty. Get a copy of the course catalog and compare it to the faculty directory. See if they actually have the staff to teach what they're advertising. And for the love of your sanity, ask about advising. If there's no dedicated advising staff, that means professors are doing it on top of teaching, research, and committee work, which usually means good luck ever getting your advisor's attention. Leaving was one of the best decisions I've ever made. Story 10. My last job was at an independent school in the UK. The very wealthy kind. The sort of place where glossy brochures show perfectly manicured lawns, ancient stone buildings, and students in blazers that cost more than your rent. One day, during what they called a period of streamlining, the entire faculty was summoned to the main hall for a big announcement. The mood from leadership was oddly upbeat, like they were about to tell us we'd all won a prize. Instead, we were informed that the school was struggling to make ends meet. Salaries, they said, were too high. Perks, they claimed, were too abundant. Spending was unsustainable. For the record, salaries were not too high. Most of us were being paid a very middle-of-the-road wage for what was essentially an all-consuming job. And perks, practically non-existent. Now, spending was unsustainable, but not because of us. It might have had something to do with the hundreds of thousands they were currently spending to redesign the senior staff offices, purely to hide some cabling and install proper wood paneling. You know, because God forbid a visiting parent should see an HDMI cable. Then came the kicker. They started listing our so-called perks and assigning them monetary values. Free parking. Yes, because the school owns acres of land and isn't in a city. Who exactly were they planning to charge? Nice surroundings. Well, sure, but that's not a perk for us. That's literally one of their selling points to rich parents. Long holidays. This one really made me laugh. We work through most of those holidays. The only difference is we're grading papers from home instead of doing it in the staff room. They hadn't even gotten to the part about what they planned to do with my job or my pay before I'd already made up my mind. I was gone in less than 3 months. Best decision I ever made. Story 11. I used to work at a well-known travel stop, basically an oversized gas station that's so ingrained in the state's culture, it might as well be on the welcome sign. They've got a reputation for being one of the good employers in the area. Over every single entrance, there's a massive sign bragging about their starting pay around $13 an hour in a state where the minimum wage is still $7.05. Customers see those numbers and assume it must be a fantastic place to work. The reality, they literally fired a girl for having a stroke. No exaggeration, she had an actual medical emergency, the kind of thing you'd think would earn you sympathy, support, or at the very least, some basic human decency. Instead, she was shown the door. So yeah, the wages might be better than flipping burgers across the street. But the second you stop being a perfectly efficient cog in their machine, you're done. Edit. Didn't expect this to get any attention. I wrote it right before clocking out from my graveyard shift, which is probably why I sound so casual about it. Trust me, working there teaches you to stop being surprised by just how disposable people are to management. Story 12. I worked at an animal hospital that prided itself on being the best in the city, or at least that's how they marketed themselves. The place had the most modern equipment money could buy. The interiors looked like they came straight out of a design magazine, and their Yelp ratings were through the roof. During the hiring process, we were told over and over how we were one big family, that everyone loved and supported each other, and that working there was more than just a job, it was a community. If that's true, then it was the most dysfunctional family imaginable, because in reality, this place was the epitome of superficial. The turnover rate was insane. People despised each other. There was absolutely zero genuine camaraderie. The pay? Terrible. Even though we charged double what every other hospital in town did for extensive care, the wages were nowhere near reflective of that. It was like the fancy equipment and glossy branding were just a mask covering up how poorly the staff was treated. I'll give management some credit. They did try to put on a good show, but it was mostly about sweeping problems under the rug instead of actually fixing anything. If anyone dared to voice a concern or complain, it was instantly labeled gossip, and people were frequently fired for it. And as if that wasn't bad enough, I later heard they installed audio recorders all over the hospital, listening devices to monitor employee conversations. I honestly don't know how anyone still puts up with working there. The whole place felt like a shiny cage. Story 13. So I was at this management retreat, 4 hours from home, with an overnight stay thrown in. The kind of retreat where you're supposed to bond with your coworkers and prove you're a team player. At some point, they pressured everyone into buying charity raffle tickets. The price? $20 each. For me, that was not pocket change. I was making about $32,000 a year and had a young daughter at home. Before my turn came, 2 middle managers, both making well over $100K, won the raffle and promptly donated their winnings back to the same charity selling the tickets. It felt like a staged game, and honestly, those guys were just part of the corporate pissing contest that kept me on the lower end of the totem pole. Then it was my turn. I won $400. At first, it should have felt like a win, some unexpected help with bills or childcare. But instead, I spent the next 2 days battling nausea, sweating over how I was going to make ends meet. Because just days earlier, my company had quietly moved the goalposts on sales performance bonuses. What I was expecting to get around $1,000 got slashed down to about $200, And now, apparently, I'm the a-hole for wanting to keep the money I won. I wasn't going to donate it back like the others. Guess I'm not a team player after all. Oh, and here's the kicker. One of those middle management types trying to set an example said we shouldn't be paid for the 4-hour drive to the retreat. Excuse me, I was on the clock from the moment I left Friday morning until I rolled back into my driveway Sunday night. If you force me to be somewhere as part of my job, all that time is work time. Unsurprisingly, my district manager didn't like that stance one bit. But by then, I was already looking for the exit. Story 14. I worked for a large pizza franchise. Yeah, that famous chain with the catchy slogan. During my interview, they told me, the work is hard, but we're like a family here. We can always talk trash about the bad customers together after a shift. Sounded decent enough, maybe a little rough around the edges, but hey, who doesn't vent after work? Reality hit like a slap in the face. The people there? Absolutely horrible. The managers? They expected me to do the work of 2 people and pay me less for it. I was making minimum wage for my age, $4 an hour. And get this, the company deliberately hired 16-year-olds because they could pay them that low rate. I was told my shift was canceled because they didn't have enough money to pay me. Yet I was promised I'd be paid to complete my training. Spoiler alert, I never saw a dime for it. The management culture was straight up toxic. Our manager would fling the corks from Prosecco bottles at waitresses just to scare them. Regular breakdowns happened from cooks and waiters alike. I'd get screamed at in front of the whole restaurant over petty stuff, like the knives and forks not being perfectly aligned. This was happening 1 week after my very first shift, and sometimes I was the only waiter left working. The waitresses were terrible too. Always talking trash about each other and shouting at me for even daring to ask questions, sometimes on my very first day. At one point, they brought in an outside chef from another restaurant who had no idea he was supposed to wash cutlery because in his previous place, that was someone else's job entirely. So we ran out of cutlery. And instead of the more experienced waitresses stepping up to help or teaching me how to handle the situation, they just hoarded the cutlery to make sure I ran out. Naturally, my manager blamed me again. Honestly, I'm done with that place. It was a nightmare wrapped in a pizza box. Story 15. My last job was with a huge cinema chain. The big selling points? Free movies and a great culture with your coworkers. On paper, it sounded like the dream gig for a movie fan. They'd recently been bought out and rolled out a whole new culture initiative, centered around 5 pillars. One of those pillars was fun. Yeah, fun. I worked at one of their biggest branches with about 50 employees. Every single morning, before the doors even opened, the managers forced us into these awful huddles like we were a football team gearing up for the big game. Cue the pep talk. All right, guys, listen up. Today's going to be great. We've got the brand new X movie, and whoever sells the most Y promotional items gets a free soda. Woo! Let's crush it today. Can you beat last week's record for best customer reviews? Whoever gets the most good reviews today wins free popcorn. Whoa! I hated every second of it. No one cared. You could see it in everyone's faces, deadpan, exhausted, and totally unmotivated. But management kept preaching this ridiculous, forced enthusiasm every single shift change, as if our lives depended on it. It was like watching a school care worker trying desperately to get a group of grown adults to build the tallest tower out of plastic bricks. Embarrassing and cringeworthy. Awful. Story 16. I was technically a manager at this call center, but don't let the title fool you. I had all the responsibilities of a full manager, training hundreds of employees, managing operations, solving problems, but was paid like a manager trainee. This call center handled outsourced calls for various clients. Mine was for a pretty big cable company in the US. Not the absolute worst client, but far from easy. My job was a nightmare juggling act. I was expected to write all the training materials from scratch and then teach around 300 employees how to use our software and systems. At the same time, I was taking non-stop tech support calls because the agents regularly needed backup. On top of that, I had to help other agents manually input sales into the system because, surprise, surprise, they never properly learned how to operate the programs. Here's the kicker. I was the only manager who actually provided ongoing support for agents who had finished training. Out of the 9 managers on site, I was the only one who actually knew how to do half the things they were telling their agents to do. The rest were just there in title, not actually helping anyone. When I finally had enough and handed in my 2 weeks' notice, they practically begged me to stay, but I was done. A few months later, the entire call center shut down. I like to think maybe my leaving was a sign of bigger problems, like management not knowing what they were doing or relying on one person to hold everything together. Honestly, I'm not sure if my departure caused it, but I can't say I was surprised it folded soon after. Story 17. My boss came up with this ridiculous campaign called Smoovers, short for Smile and Move. The idea was that we all had to be smoovers, constantly smiling and encouraging other associates to be happy about working in what was basically a dead-end corporate retail job. He even handed out bracelets for us to wear and little cards to keep on our person at all times, like some weird cult ritual. Here's the thing, we worked at a crappy timeshare property. Originally owned by a small group of folks who had invested back in the early 2000s, the place was later bought out by a massive hotel conglomerate that completely destroyed the original charm and aesthetic. The owners, they were bitter and hateful, constantly whining and demanding refunds over the dumbest things like a broken treadmill in the gym. I remember one ridiculous incident, perfectly summed up my entire time there. A fully grown man, followed by his wife about an hour later, was yelling, like literally raising his voice in the lobby at me. I was young, visibly pregnant, and this guy was screaming because a lifeguard had moved their towel off a beach chair after they'd left for 2 hours to nap in their room. Oh, and this happened on the 4th of July while the resort was at full capacity. On top of that, we were bombarded with daily emails reminding us that working for the hotel was the best choice we've ever made in life, along with endless pep talks from upper management about our mission in life, your life's purpose, the reason you were born. Basically, our entire job was to reason with unreasonable, entitled people every single day and try to get them to give us a perfect 5-star rating on their surveys. No thanks, I turned down every transfer request I got and got out as fast as I could. Story 18. I worked at a hospital that was going through what they called a culture change. They brought in a fancy management group to help get the finances in better shape. So what was their very first recommendation? Slash nursing staff and cut pay. Within 90 days, we lost 10% of our nurses. We were stretched so thin that legally and safely caring for patients became a daily struggle. Meanwhile, the management team and senior executives took a 2-week Caribbean vacation fully paid by the hospital. Flights, food, rooms, alcohol, everything was on the hospital's dime. I found out about this when I came into work the next morning, only to see an email telling me that the 4 nursing positions I desperately needed filled were denied due to budget constraints. I pride myself on being level-headed and rational, even when I'm angry or frustrated. But that was the last straw. I didn't even open the email. Everything I needed to know was in the subject line. 5 minutes later, I was on the phone with the local newspaper, setting up an interview with a journalist. I told him to bring a big notebook. I made sure my staff had their vacations approved and any bonuses locked in. I did everything I could to support my unit, then quietly left. I dropped the key to my office along with my resignation letter at HR. They called, begging me to stay. I told them it would take hiring 4 new nurses to make that happen. I never heard back. I spoke with the reporter a couple of times, spilling everything the truth about what the community was paying for every day. He ran a small story that slowly caught fire. From what I heard from former employees, many were forced out after that, with some facing court over minor financial charges and one even accused of embezzlement. The hospital was in deep trouble and eventually got bought out by a larger entity. Supposedly, things are much better now, but those of us who stayed through it all went through hell. And the best part? That pricey culture change program they bragged about? Never used. The box literally sat there, unopened, like some kind of monument to wasted money. Story 19. I landed a job at a small company, thanks to a family hookup. They raved about the owner, said he was so great, so successful. 2 weeks in, I found out the entire business model was built on theft. The guy was running a straight-up scam. I didn't know it at the time, but he eventually ended up in prison long after I'd left. What made things worse was that he was a complete nightmare to work for. The guy was mean, borderline cruel. One day, out of nowhere, he held an impromptu roast session and made fun of the receptionist's weight. Yeah, that didn't go over well at all. Honestly, he was like a Michael Scott without a shred of charm or humor. I didn't have my CPA license yet, but I had some accounting background from college, so I was able to realize what was happening and get out fast. I handed in my resignation as soon as I could. My family was furious. They thought I was being irresponsible for quitting so soon. They didn't know about the fraud, just assumed I was being difficult. When the owner was later dragged into federal court on criminal charges, they still tried to defend him, but at least then they understood why I left. Story 20. I didn't exactly quit because of it, but at one of my previous jobs, my boss would sometimes hold these motivation meetings. You know the type. PowerPoint presentations filled with cheesy inspirational quotes about teamwork, drive, and all that corporate pep talk nonsense. At first, you'd think it was all well-intentioned, but it was impossible to take seriously once we found out he was stealing from the company. Money that was supposed to be reinvested into the business, straight into his own pocket. What made it worse was how he expected us to suddenly be motivated just because he slapped together one of these presentations. No speeches, no genuine talk. He'd just show the slides, and that was it. Like seriously, what did he expect, that we'd jump up and start cheering? The actual work environment was pretty chill. No drama, no office politics, nothing toxic. But once you realize your boss is using you all while trying to put on a fake motivated and inspired front, it's hard not to want out ASAP. Story 21. I worked at a so-called startup, except it had been a startup for over 8 years and kept calling itself that until it finally broke even. I gave everything I had. Nights, weekends, all for a salary that looked decent for 40 hours a week, but absolutely sucked when you factor in the 60-plus hours I actually worked. I fought hard to get the company to rewrite a critical business app from scratch. The original was built by a contractor who kept ownership of the source code, meaning we couldn't fix bugs or update it properly. I had just 3 conditions. 1. The company must own the source code. 2. The new dev had to actually understand SQL, unlike the first guy. I needed enough time to write a full project spec, not just a vague website plat backend stuff, government API. Finally, the CEO gave the green light to the project. Glorious day. Then, disaster. They hired the exact same one-man developer who wrote the first version. Same deal. He kept the source code rights and was on a sweet contract for ongoing support. Oh, and he started working without a proper spec because he knows what he's doing. That was my cue. I'd be leaving soon to mine. Very soon. 8 years in, the CEO finally announced the company was profitable and was signing checks for the first shareholder dividend. Surely now my salary would be adjusted after years of inflation eating away at it. At my review, a director praised me for single-handedly keeping the company afloat. Then the CEO said, effective immediately, my salary was going up by $1,000 a year. That's less than 50 cents an hour on a 40-hour week, closer to 30 cents given my actual hours. By any reasonable measure, it should have been 10 times that. He then dangled a $1,500 bonus if I could get the developer's app live in 3 months. I explained there was no way. We needed a government data center connection that would take up to 2 months to set up, and we couldn't even start until the CEO approved the budget that had been sitting on his desk forever. I went back to my office, called a recruiter, and less than a month later, handed in my notice. Within 3 months, I'd sold my house and moved cities. Within a year, in a much better role, I was making over 150% of my old salary. Quitting was the best thing I ever did. I just wish I'd done it sooner. Story 22. I used to work at a really popular Canadian chain restaurant. I saw the owner a few times, but had no idea she was the owner. Then, about 6 months in, she finally introduced herself. Within 30 minutes of that introduction, she was yelling at me multiple times about my work performance and uniform. And not quietly. She did it right in front of customers, and then again in the back where everyone at the front could hear her perfectly well. She was just complaining, listing things she didn't like, but never once telling me how to actually fix or improve them. Keep in mind, I'd been doing the exact same job the same way for 6 months, and not a single manager or supervisor had ever said a word. I quit a few days later. I was only 16, but old enough to know that if this is how messed up the company was, there was no way I was sticking around. Story 23. Culture doesn't pay the bills. I took a job at an established tech company. Their big pitch? They were a $50 million company aiming to hit $200 million in 2 years. Pretty quickly, I realized it was all a load of crap. They were nowhere near $50 million in sales, more like 1 deal a week. To hit $200 million, they needed 5 deals a day. Their tech? Good, but seriously outdated. The market had already left them in the dust, and they didn't even realize it. Great culture, though. That's why people stuck around. It was a nice place to work, nobody had to actually work hard, and there were tons of fun perks for employees. Story 24. I can't say I ever had a job where I had to get out, but I've definitely had a few that sold me on unrealistic, dishonest culture promises. Fresh out of high school, I got a warehouse job. On orientation day, they told us, "We believe you don't live to work. You work so you can live." Cool, right? Then they scheduled me for 70 hours a week. Thankfully, it was just a summer gig. In college, I worked at Wendy's where they kept calling us a family. I thought, nope, you're just how I pay my bills while I get my degree. I wouldn't remember half these people a year after quitting. Spoiler, I was right. Story 25. I didn't leave the company, but I did bail on my department, switched from the business side to IT. For about 2 years, including the first 2 years of my son's life, I was grinding 60-70 hours a week. My manager was regularly putting in 80-90 hours and had been doing it for years. There was more than enough overtime to justify hiring at least one more full-time person, but upper management refused. They insisted our workload wasn't that bad, meaning we weren't that far behind. They completely ignored the fact that we were burning insane overtime just to keep up. It would have been way more cost-effective to hire another person, but they didn't care. So I moved over to IT, where hours were more normal, about 45 a week, and I got a decent raise that basically made up for losing all the overtime. IT culture has its own problems, but I'd never go back to my old department. The company overall is great, so I'm still there. But some departments, they're run by people who clearly don't see us as humans. Story 26. I was working a telemarketing sales role for a startup in the wine industry. To give some background, I had just stepped away from a decade-long career in sales and business development to focus on full-time study. I wanted something low-stress with decent hours, a job that wouldn't suck the life out of me and would let me maintain a healthy work-life balance. So when I came across this startup that was fun, had a great vibe, or so they said, and sold wine over the phone, I figured it was a perfect fit. I knew sales, I liked wine, so why not? From the start, I made it clear that I wasn't a wine expert. I wasn't the best salesperson in the world either, but I was diligent, hitting every measurable target they set for me. So objectively, I was doing my job well. Yet something felt off. Almost immediately, I began to notice a pattern that made me increasingly uncomfortable. I was regularly pulled aside by supervisors to review recordings of my calls. That wouldn't be unusual in sales, except the supervisors were poorly trained. They'd never had formal education or coaching experience in developing staff, which meant their feedback was often confusing and unhelpful. Then, things took a weird turn. After successfully completing a 3-month induction training and even receiving a certificate for it, I was suddenly slapped with a performance improvement plan, not a management plan. No, they insisted this was an improvement plan, implying something was seriously wrong. The kicker? The very first metric they wanted me to improve was my personality. Yes, my personality. I quote them directly. I needed to be more human. I was stunned, confused, upset, and frankly angry. The message was clear. Who I was, my polite, kind, and respectful self, was not good enough. Apparently, I wasn't cool enough, quirky enough, loud enough, or unique enough for their idea of what a salesperson should be. It felt like they wanted me to perform some kind of caricature or put on an act rather than just be genuine. This was the moment the facade cracked for me. All those perks, the ping pong tables, the free wine, the monthly happy hours, birthday parties, and holiday celebrations suddenly felt like a smokescreen. A way to distract employees from the fact that they weren't investing in real growth, real development, or even basic respect for the people who kept their startup afloat. I realized the constant rewards and fun activities were just a thin veneer, designed to imitate what a good culture looks like without actually being one. Instead of listening to the team's needs and providing meaningful support, they were pushing people to fit into a mold that served their image, not their employees. After that experience, I lost all interest in the whole startup culture hype. It made me cynical about companies that throw money at superficial perks but ignore the real work of building a supportive, respectful environment. Sometimes, culture isn't about ping pong tables or free wine. It's about respect, clear communication, and genuinely investing in your people. And when that's missing, no amount of parties will make up for it. Not everything is as it seems. Story 27. I was working quality assurance for a small cottage company. A team of about 30 people total, with 5 in upper management. The business was clearly booming in terms of sales, which on the surface sounded great. They set this arbitrary production goal. 300 finished units had to be completed and shipped every single day before anyone was allowed to leave work. Sounds straightforward, right? Well, not when the failure rate on those units was over 60%. In QA, our job was to certify that each product was both functional and flawless before it got shipped out. The units sold for anywhere between $150 to $500 depending on custom options. So when over half the product coming off the line was failing, it was bleeding the company dry, not just on materials, but also in wasted labor and lost customer trust. After months of grueling 14-hour days, 6 days a week, I knew something had to change. I took it upon myself to create a detailed running list of every kind of failure, tracking exactly where it came from on the production line. 3 months later, I had a mountain of data complete with charts and visuals showing how we could save the company over $1 million in just the next year. I started working directly with the production team, sharing findings and collaborating on fixes. Everyone was exhausted from the long hours, so they welcomed the chance to improve things. Slowly, the failure rate dropped from over 60% to about 39%. Then one day, the big boss storms onto the floor. "Don't you work in QA? Why are you up here?" he demanded, in front of everyone. I explained what I'd been doing and how it was helping the company. That's when I found out the production manager had been taking all the credit for my work and hadn't told the boss a thing. I asked for 15 minutes after lunch to show my findings. At first, the boss refused. Then I said, "Not even if it could save you several $1,000,000. That got me the meeting. In the end, the boss demanded all my data and methods. I had a bad feeling, so I asked, "Why does it feel like I'm about to get fired?" His response, "I haven't decided yet." That was it for me. I walked out, deleted every bit of my data, and left the company for good. I can still imagine his face when he realized the improvements he'd been bragging about were gone with me. Story 28. I don't think it was just one specific moment that made me decide to leave this job. It was more like a slow, grinding realization over time. I worked at a large retail chain, one of those places that constantly bragged about their family culture and how everyone was a team. Every single morning, without fail, there was a mandatory team meeting. The format was always the same. They'd go over the daily sales numbers and talk about money, occasionally throw in a happy birthday shout-out for someone. And then here's the kicker. They'd do this bizarre, loud chant of the store's name. Like, picture a room full of exhausted retail workers forced to cheer and chant as if it was some kind of pep rally. Now, the kicker for me was that I was still recovering from mono. My tonsils were swollen to the point I could barely speak above a whisper without feeling like my throat was on fire. I literally couldn't make it through that stupid chant without intense pain. So I made the call to opt out of the team chant that day. About an hour later, I got pulled into the manager's office and was slapped with a write-up for not participating in a mandatory team activity. Yep, because apparently showing up to work with nearly incapacitated vocal cords wasn't enough to prove I was committed. The worst part, these morning meetings weren't tucked away in some quiet back room. They were right smack in the middle of the store near the registers, where customers could watch us perform this whole song and dance. The company wanted to project this perfect image of how happy and engaged we all were, like we were a bunch of cheerful, motivated family members. So if you were working in, say, the meat department and a customer needed help, tough luck. They had to wait until the team was done with their numbers review and store chant. Customer service took a back seat to the optics of this forced cheerleading. This wasn't a one-off either. Every morning, no exceptions. No sympathy for anyone who was sick, struggling, or just straight up didn't want to act like they were at a cult meeting. After that write-up, I realized this wasn't the kind of place that valued real people or real problems. They cared more about the show than about us. That's when I knew it was time to get out. Story 29. I worked for a law enforcement agency that constantly prided itself on being world-class and elite, the best of the best. It sounded great on paper, but reality hit me hard during my very first week. A coworker took me out to lunch and gave me the lowdown on how things really worked. It wasn't about doing a good job or upholding the law. It was about bending rules and getting with the program. He explained how much overtime you could claim without raising eyebrows, how minor infractions often got overlooked to protect insiders, and how the system was set up to shield its own. Then, he bragged about some credentials he'd obtained for a higher position he didn't actually hold, something he'd never show inside the agency but loved flashing around outside. It felt like a strange status symbol. The same guy then went on about how he minimized his taxes in questionable ways, even mentioning that he claimed a lunch and, surprisingly, his son's dog as a service animal for tax credits. Here's the kicker. This guy was the agency chaplain. If you'd told me all this before I started, I wouldn't have believed it. On top of that, when I tried to raise serious concerns about policies, I was met with dismissive answers like, "We don't do that here, it's big boy rules." Big boy rules basically meant there were no real rules. Just whatever the boss said went. And if things went wrong, you were the one who took the blame. The culture was exhausting and had real consequences. This year alone, the agency has lost 2 people to suicide. If you're struggling with mental health, please know help is available. You're not alone. The good news, my last day is next Friday. I'm finally moving on from that difficult chapter. Story 30. I worked for a company that really liked to think of itself as the next Google. They went all out on the fun office vibe, the kind of place where the walls are plastered with motivational posters and you can't walk 5 feet without running into some Nerf guns, beanbags, or quirky decor meant to make everything feel wacky and casual. The leadership wouldn't stop talking about how it was one big family, how everyone was supposed to feel like they belonged, and how they really cared about work-life balance and team spirit. But beneath all the surface-level cheer and playful distractions, things were seriously off. The first big red flag hit me when I found out about the relatively new team member, a woman who had only been there for a short time but had suddenly been promoted to manager. The promotion wasn't because of her skills or experience, though. Nope. It came after it was pretty widely known, at least among us, that she had been hooking up with one of the higher-ups. What made it worse? After her promotion, some of the most competent and hard-working people on the team started getting fired. No warnings, no real feedback, just suddenly out. It quickly became clear these firings were less about performance and more about personal grudges. This new manager simply didn't like certain people and had the power to push them out. I got called into a sit-down meeting with this manager and the higher-up she was involved with. They framed it as a discussion about issues with the team, but the whole thing felt like a setup. It was painfully obvious the goal was to intimidate and silence anyone who might rock the boat or challenge their authority. That was my moment of clarity. The fancy office perks, the family talk, and all the supposed culture were just a facade to cover favoritism, toxicity, and cronyism. The company didn't care about people. It cared about keeping its own little clique happy and protected. I got out as fast as I could, and honestly, I've never looked back. I'm so damn glad to be out of there. Story 31. I was working for an Italian company that decided to expand into the US. They sent a small group of about 10 elite engineers, including me and my wife. We were both in our early 30s to open their first US branch. The offer sounded pretty good at first. 1.5 times our salary from Italy, plus a solid benefits package. We got great health insurance, a flight back to Italy once a year, a 401k plan, and a decent holiday allowance. On paper, it looked like a fair deal, especially since relocating to the US is a big move. Once we arrived, though, the reality hit hard. We quickly realized that compared to typical US tech salaries and benefits, we were severely underpaid. Still, we stuck around because the CEO was a genuinely nice guy who promised us a fast track to management and assured us both green cards, so our future in the US seemed secure. For 3 years, we put our heads down and worked hard, believing in the promises. Then the CEO suddenly quit. A new CEO flew in to visit our branch and gave a speech that still burns in my memory. He basically told us to brace for a harsh reality. No more flights back home, holidays cut in half, no career progression for the next 5 years, and the green card process could be delayed indefinitely at the company's discretion. His parting shot? You're lucky to have this experience. It's something your colleagues back in Italy don't have, and it'll look great on your CV for your next opportunity. And it did. For all 10 of us, that experience ended up being our ticket out. Fast forward 3 years, the company reaches out again, asking if we want to come back. Their excuse? We learned from our mistakes and now need experienced people because no US citizens want to work here for the salary we're offering. I didn't even hesitate. I told them I'd rather spend my days picking fly crap off the floor for $1 an hour than work for them again. Story 32. I won't name the company, but the environment there was incredibly toxic. My manager regularly insulted me with hurtful names, and one of the associates sent me upsetting messages, making me feel isolated and unwelcome. My manager would openly talk down to me in front of customers as if humiliating me was some kind of power move. I have a medical condition that sometimes made it hard to keep going at work. One day, after needing to rest, my manager cruelly asked me how it felt not being able to have children because of my condition. That moment really broke me. I tried to get help from the district manager, but he dismissed my concerns, saying my coworkers were just stressed and still recovering from the holidays. There was no real effort to fix the situation. The anxiety from that place took a serious toll on me. I found a hotline to report the toxic environment anonymously. Just before, another employee had reported her manager for not letting her take medication on time and was left feeling lost and upset. I knew my complaint would come next, and I couldn't face more humiliation. So I took some time off, gathered myself, looked for a new job, and finally handed in my 2 weeks. That job affected my mental health deeply, but things turned around when I left. My new workplace is kind, respectful, and supportive. I haven't had a bad day since. I hope anyone thinking about working there hears this. The so-called culture they promote doesn't match reality. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.